We have had two people who sat with you in the cabinet at the time, Claire Short and Paul Boateng, telling us they think that the cabinet should have seen the full advice, the document of the 7th of March, but you don't agree with them.
Well, I didn't desire to see it. I accepted the Attorney General's view, as most people do in cabinet. You ask, is this legal or illegal? He will work out all the processes. We were aware it was a judgment. In Paul's case, I don't know, I have not talked to him about it. He has a legal background, I suppose he would be very interested in legally reading it through. Did he say he disagreed with the final judgment?
Well, he said what he said in his evidence.
That's quite important, isn't it? We want to read it in order to see whether the judgment was right. I mean, did he not accept the judgment? It was clear enough to the cabinet the reasons. It wasn't, I will come in and say, yes, it is legal. He gave us the reasons why. Using other resolutions he had arrived that it was reasonable to say you could legally justify a military intervention.
Now that's exactly the point, reasonable. Do you think the cabinet should have been aware of what Lord Goldsmith meant by reasonable? Do you think they should have been?
No, they only want to know whether it is legal or not. Reasonable, there are whole books in law devoted to what's reasonable. All I wanted to know, and I think the cabinet and the Prime Minister, is it legal and can you legally justify military intervention? He said yes.
He said in his document of the 7th of March to the Prime Minister that a reasonable case does not mean that if the matter ever came before a court I would be confident that the court would agree with this view. Now if you had known that was how he interpreted reasonable, that is, I will not necessarily win with this in court.
Blimey.
Would that have influenced your opinion?
No. Lawyers always talk about the argument what's meant by reasonable. That is a constant argument in all our courts, almost the reason why we have the courts. All I want to know from him, frankly, myself, is this. Whatever the case, reasonable or not, is there a legal justification? Is it a legal act to enter into a military intervention in Iraq? He said, no, you could legally justify it. Frankly, as a responsible cabinet minister, that's what I want to know. He is there to give the advice.
You wouldn't have wanted him to say to you, I can call this reasonable, but I would not necessarily win with this in court. That would not have influenced your view.
Listen, anybody had seen Peter all through this process was not a very happy bunny. He knew there were difficult situations, he knew the interpretations may well be difficult, but at the end of the day he would have to make a judgment. I think in his evidence to you he talked about when was the time he was asked the question. He said there were debates going on, but it was only when he was asked as the Attorney General to give that advice. Once he was asked, and it was well into the arguments publicly about whether it is legal or not. We had resignations, I think, even from the Foreign Office of Lawyers in this dispute as to whether it was legal or not, and when he was asked, he came to that judgment. He used UN resolutions. Reasonable or not, yes, it was legal.
The resignation from the Foreign Office I think only happened at the very end of this process.
Yes, but you saw in the evidence there were big arguments going on between the legal advisers as to whether it was or was not.
Yes. We have heard those arguments extensively.
Yes.
And they are very interesting. You say he was not a happy bunny, and when you talked to the New Statesman last year you said he was not a happy man. What do you mean by that? Why wasn't he happy?
He had the weight on his shoulders about having to give a legal opinion about something that the best course of action for UN support was to get the second resolution. If you didn't get a second resolution, it was very clear if you got the second resolution, but if you didn't, the problem didn't stop there. He knew there would be a question then. The Americans were very clear they didn't need it, they believed in regime change anyway. So to that extent he knew he would be pressured for his judgment. It is not an easy judgment to make, as we can remind ourselves of the cost of the Iraq War, a very, very difficult decision. For the Prime Minister as well, but at the end of the day in government you must make a decision. You must be clear you are being advised it is legal. If not, you will be pursued for illegal act and all sorts of war criminal charges if you don't have that. So we were conscious about it, but don't forget this also, that argument then went to Parliament, Lords and Commons, and they voted in support.
If he had not been able to find a reasonable case after we had failed to get a second resolution, what would have happened?
I think if you haven't got an agreement on UN grounds, it would have been very difficult to get an agreement in Parliament, whether in the Lords or Commons.
But we did not get an agreement from the UN?
No. Well, I mean, you are into the argument about the uses. The way I would see it, resolutions, you mentioned 678, there was another one, 872, I think it was. They were both connected in that sense, that if he didn't carry out what he was required to in those legislations, then they would take action against him. That was implicit in 678. It wasn't in 1443, and the judgment made then was to use the authority, as you well know, in 678 to do the intervention, and that was a legal action. It was legal in that interpretation. As you just mentioned before, perhaps he was not happy whether he could win that case in court. We can't wait to go to the court to find out. The courts, judges and indeed academics were very much disagreed as to whether it was right or wrong. We had to make a decision. We asked for the advice. The man to give it to the cabinet was the Attorney General. He told us it was legal and we accepted it.
If he had not been able to find a reasonable case, what would have happened?
If you couldn't get a UN connection, I think it would have been very difficult. I don't think then those in the cabinet, or indeed I think in Parliament, would have agreed if it had just been a unilateral action.